All right. Friday, I'm going to be down in Clemson again working on the FE exam. I go down there several times per year to write questions for the FE, and I'll be there on Friday. So that day's lecture will be posted online. I'll send you an email with the link. I'll also post it on MU Online. So also on Friday, homework 15 is due. That's kind of the culmination of all of the cost estimation ideas that we've been going over for the last several lectures. Today we're going to be discussing indirect cost allocation and activity-based costing, which are the last concepts from Chapter 15. In Friday's lecture, which will be posted online, it's going to begin some information related to depreciation, which is the reduction in value for equipment over time. Any questions related to the announcements? There's also two additional things besides this cost estimation stuff that we're going to talk about just at the beginning of class because I think we had a little extra time. I've been grading some of the projects, and rather than write the same thing 30 times, I thought I'd just demonstrate to you one key point from the spreadsheets here in class, and that way we all kind of understand the same thing all at once. So let me bring that up. I've got an example of a correct spreadsheet file, and I've shown this before much earlier in the semester. I showed you basically how to do the spreadsheet, but it probably makes more sense and means more now that you've been through it on your own. Now, a lot of people have done it correctly. Several people, when I've looked at the spreadsheets, had some mistakes. So I just thought we'd go through a correct spreadsheet together to make sure that we are all on the same page on the characteristics. All right, I don't remember exactly whose spreadsheet this is, but probably they recognize it. It's like your own little child, right? You begin to know the characteristics of your spreadsheet and love it like a child. All right, so this person assumed that their starting salary would be $66,975, and in the report there was some supporting information about that. And you'll notice that each year the amount is increasing due to the assumed cost of living adjustment / inflation rate, and that's good. That's what you should be doing there. The regular expenses are likewise indexed for inflation, and there's also this factor which is related to taxes. Okay, so each year it's increasing, and the taxes are being accounted for. Now, what some people had trouble with, extraordinary expenses, people usually did a fine job with that. In a few cases, there were some issues related to calculating how much was saved in a year. And of course, the amount you can save is just the difference between your income and your outflows. So here it's the income minus both of the expenses. Now, this is the column where actually there is some confusion. And your investment yield isn't related to just the amount you save in this year. It's not just related to this year's income. The investment yield is saying how much did you make based on the total value of all of your savings in the previous year. So in year one of this, I guess year zero of this person's career, they don't have any earnings because what we're using is the end of period assumption, that it's at the end of the year that you actually get your income, have the expenses, and then have this surplus that goes into savings. And so what we're assuming is that the end of year zero is when this deposit is made to the savings account, but during year zero there's no investment yield because there wasn't any savings in the account at the beginning of the year. But now in year one, what you can see, they correctly said that the investment yield for that year is related to the previous year's savings balance. And so how much was in the account at the end of year zero is how much you're going to be credited for to earn interest during the first year. And this 2.78% was explained in their report. It was like a weighted average rate of return, where some of their savings was going to go into a low yield checking account, some of it was going to be put into a 401k that was a little bit more risky, but then had a higher rate of return. And so this is a weighted average, but with each year, what you can see is the cumulative savings balance is the previous year's balance, how much goes in during this year, which is itself the result of in minus out, and then the investment yield for this year, which is based on last year's balance. So it has three components, and all three of the components are dependent on what's happened before. And so there's like a big chain of dependencies there where the amount saved for this year is income minus expenses. Investment yield, which is in purple, is based on the percentage and the previous year's savings balance, and then the savings balance is what came in this year, what was earned in interest this year, and then how much was in the savings last year, so the net difference. Now this 2.78%, it's fine for purposes of this project to just assume 1% through your entire career. But the reality is that a lot of people adopt a strategy of relatively decreasing risk as they get closer to retirement. Because the last thing you want to have happen is to be in like your late 60s, almost ready to retire in your mind, and then there's like an economic crash that wipes out your life savings. Now it's okay when you're young to tolerate those wild swings in the market, because if you lose 30% one year, hopefully the next year you'll make back 38%, and over the long run the average is favorable. But if you're really close to retirement, what a lot of people do is they start shifting more of their investments away from stocks and into more secure investments like bonds or mutual funds or like government-backed securities or annuities, things that have a guaranteed rate of return and less of a risk that you're losing the principal. So here, in each case, the investment yield was just based on the cumulative savings balance, but the rate of return on investment may change over time, is my point. Well, I'm going to have to look at the report a second time and take a look at what did this person spend $469,000 on in year 36. That sounds like a lot of fun. I'll have to track them down and be a good friend that year. All right, so any questions about that? I mean, I'll still point it out in the comments when I'm evaluating your report if you've made any of those errors related to investment yield is the one that seems to be the most commonly misunderstood. I'll still write a brief note mentioning that if it was an issue in your spreadsheet, but I just wanted to demonstrate it here in class in case it could be a chance for any follow-up questions. All right, so I'm still making my way through those, but I've got some time on the plane as I'm headed down to Clemson, and hopefully I'll be able to grade at a little bit faster rate than I have so far. The other thing that we're going to talk about besides that project is Bitcoin. Bitcoin's been in the news a little bit more recently. I mean, it was in the news a lot about 18 months ago. But then since the price is going up a little bit more lately, it's been in the news again. So I don't know if many people here have actually taken the time to understand the fundamentals of Bitcoin, but there's a pretty informative, brief video we'll just take a look at, and then we'll discuss what is Bitcoin, because this is a class that's partially related to economics.
What is Bitcoin?
Whoa, that's
Bitcoin.
All right, let's see here. All right. Maybe I should switch over to Chrome. It's a little bit less clumsy. I don't even know how to copy the link. Edge, foiled again. Let's do this the old-fashioned way.
What is Bitcoin? Bitcoin is the first decentralized digital currency.
Oops, I need to pause this, otherwise I will get my video boosted. So how many people here have Bitcoins? Anybody own Bitcoins? Just 3 of us? I've got some Bitcoins. Less than I used to have, but So the characteristics of money, like there's a commonly set of definitions of what is money. And let's see if Bitcoin meets these criteria. First of all, you have to be able to use it without it wearing down. So you wouldn't be able to use cotton candy as money, for example, because it's just not durable enough. So Bitcoin doesn't wear out because it's just an electronic transaction, and so there isn't any physical damage that can occur. Portability, you have to be able to take the money with you as you go about your business. And so if your currency was like granite slabs, it would be inconvenient to pay your bills if you had to carry a pocket full of granite slabs wherever you went. And so Bitcoin is definitely portable. It's more portable than gold or currency because actually all you need to have is a passphrase, and you can go anywhere in the world and have access to your money. Divisibility has to be easily broken up into smaller denominations, and so back to the example of what if we were paying with like sand dollars or stones. It's not easy to make change in a situation like that. And even sometimes you have that problem with currency, especially in some of the foreign countries I've been to before. It's like people don't want to take large bills. Like if you try and buy something in a shop with a 100 dirham note, then they'll sometimes roll their eyes and ask you if you've got smaller change, and it's a little bit of a hassle. Whereas Bitcoin, you can spend fractions of a penny, like the number of digits, like significant digits, are way smaller than even a penny. Uniformity is a little bit complicated, but I mean, a dollar is always worth $1, but there have been some cases where like the government has retired a currency, and so then there would be simultaneously circulating like old shekels and new shekels. Like Israel is one country where they introduced a new currency part of the way through. Zimbabwe is another one where they had hyperinflation, and so the old dollar, or the old, I don't even remember what the name of their currency is in Zimbabwe, but the point is that since they replaced their currency, then any two units of money wouldn't necessarily be uniform because it was the old dollars and the new dollars. Limited supply is kind of an interesting one because I think a lot of people know that the government, which prints money, could at any time print as much as they like. And really what constrains them from doing that is that the consequences would be so grave. If you just print lots of extra money and there's more supply of money, then that's what drives hyperinflation. But Bitcoin, there's within the program just a limited number of Bitcoin. I think the most there will ever be is 21 million Bitcoin, and so that kind of keeps the price from hyperinflating. And now there's still plenty of fluctuation and there's a lot of volatility in Bitcoin pricing, but it's not because of excess supply, at least. Really where the main problem with Bitcoin is an acceptability, because although that video said you can buy anything you want with Bitcoin, you usually have to exchange it out of Bitcoin and into fiat currency before you buy anything. I mean, there's an increasing number of places where you can use Bitcoin, like websites usually, technology companies, web services, and so on. But maybe we'll talk a little bit more about Bitcoin. Back in 2010 is when I first learned about it, and I set up my computer at home to start mining Bitcoin. And I ended up accumulating, I mean, not enough that I could retire, but enough that things were interesting when the price went really high about 18 months ago. And I mean, that's not a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. There's always going to be evolutions in what is currency, and so understanding these characteristics is kind of what made me interested in Bitcoin, is I knew what attributes something had to have in order to be considered money. And so if you're aware of those similar characteristics, then you might be able to spot future opportunities as they evolve in the future. So we'll come back to this topic and talk more about Bitcoin when we've got a few spare minutes in future lectures. But what we're going to, as far as the book material is concerned, talk about now is the difference between indirect costs and direct costs. And Remember, we've talked about this in a couple of different lectures so far in the semester, and this interesting example I found online today, and it kind of illustrates the expenses that go directly into producing things versus indirect is just the general business costs that you have to pay to keep the company going. So the difference between what you're producing and what you have to keep the entity alive. And so you could think about the calories that you consume in a similar way. There's a lot of apps where you can put in your exercise and put in what you ate, and then it does an energy balance in the same way that you can do like a dollar balance in a spreadsheet. And that energy balance on an app would sometimes break into the calories that you burn through like your moving around activities like running, walking, doing exercise, and then the calories that you burn just as your basal metabolic rate. Like even if you just sit in a chair watching Netflix all day, you're still burning calories. And so we can think of that overhead expenditure of energy as similar to the indirect costs. Even if you don't do anything, you're still going to burn some calories. And so a business, even if they don't produce anything, these indirect costs still have to be covered. But then when they do produce things, those direct costs can be directly attributed to the things that are being produced. So then in cost estimation, the question is, how do we account for and recover the indirect costs? That's what this whole chapter has been all about, is like in the future, projecting how much things are going to be when we're trying to evaluate opportunities. And it's difficult to assign to a specific output the indirect costs, but our book in chapter 15 has this table of suggestions. And so it's suggesting that, for example, if you are trying to recover the cost of taxes, then if it was property taxes, for example, one way to try and recover those costs would be on the basis of the space that's occupied for certain types of equipment. So if your business is making several different items, then how much space is occupied by the machine to produce each item is how you could figure out who pays which taxes. Or if you're trying to recover indirect costs associated with utility costs like heat, light, power, and so on, then there's a variety of different ways you could do it. You could do it on a space basis, but you could also look at the number of outlets in each area, because that might be reflective of how the electricity is also is actually being consumed. But if you even wanted to get a little bit more sophisticated than that, then you might actually look at how are the outlets being used. If we're talking about electrical and power costs, then why would you just base it on square footage when maybe you could look at how many horsepower hours? So machines that use more electricity and have higher power demands than others maybe should pay a greater share of the indirect costs. So each one of these is just a list of ways that you can allocate the costs to a certain project. All right, so to practice those ideas and to illustrate what we're talking about in indirect cost allocation, I've created this example where what we're doing is we're trying to, for a construction company, figure out how much of the indirect costs should go to each of the subsidiaries. This construction company has 3 different branches. It's got an excavation branch, it's got steel assembly, and surveying. And they all have their own characteristics. Some of them are bringing in a lot of revenue, some of them have a lot of employees. It's the whole spectrum. So in A through D, what it's doing is it's proposing different ways to carve up which of these 3 subsidiaries is going to have to pay how much of the $6.95 million in indirect costs. So remember, indirect costs are just the expenses that you have to pay to keep the business going, regardless of how much output there is. So it has to be covered, and we're trying to look for who to stick the bill with of those 3 possibilities. So A through D kind of steps you through the different opportunities for breaking it up. what does this phrase mean, proportional to their base revenue? Who can help us interpret that phrase, proportional to base revenue?
So you find what percentage of that each of them are of the total base revenue?
Right, yeah. So the idea there is that if the indirect costs are 6.9 million, it wouldn't be fair to just divide it by 3 because the excavation company is making so much more revenue than the surveying division. And so the way to figure out how to allocate the indirect costs is what we're saying is add up the total revenue and then the percentage that each company contributes to the total revenue will determine how much of the indirect costs they have to cover. So it looks like the excavation company is going to have to chip in about 5.4 million, the steel company about $1 million, and the surveying division about $555,000. That'll be their proportional shares of the overall indirect costs. And since they do such different things, they're all going to have a different way of recovering that. They're going to just pass it along to their customers, obviously. And so maybe if you've shipped something at UPS before, you've noticed that they have a separate line item that's a fuel recovery surcharge. Airlines often do the same thing, where as the cost of gas goes up, then they just tack that on as a separate fee onto the ticket. And so what we're saying is that here, in the case of the excavation company, what they do is they're recovering $5.3 million on the basis of 180 cubic meters of excavation. So that means that they're going to have to tack on an additional fee of $29.92 for every cubic meter that they excavate. So they'll charge their customers what they always have, but they also, in order to cover the indirect costs, are going to have to charge an additional amount that'll go towards the indirect. And so then there's a similar thing that we're doing in Part C for the steel assembly and Part D for the surveying division. Part B and C are pretty easy because the thing that they're doing is easily measurable. You know, cubic meters of soil excavated, linear feet of steel that's assembled. But maybe Part D is a little bit less obvious because it's an abstract concept like a indirect charge on a percentage basis. What we're saying is we know that they normally would take $1.4 million from their customers. To cover their indirect cost obligation to the parent company, they're going to also have to kick upstairs $554,511. So the total amount that they're going to be taking from their customers is $1.4 million plus the indirect cost that they're going to be contributing to the holding company. And so that total is the direct cost and the indirect cost. So F represents the indirect cost. And our question is, what percentage of the direct cost should the indirect cost factor be in order to be able to return all of that revenue to the holding company? So it should be 39.6% as the indirect cost factor. All right. The other topic is really closely related to this. Activity-based costing is closely related, and in activity-based costing, probably the new information that you need to be aware of is some of this terminology. What we're calling a cost center in the lingo of accounting is just the products or the services that a company is selling to its clients. And these cost centers receive allocated costs. The allocated indirect costs that couldn't be covered in a direct way, because the indirect costs, remember, don't generate revenue on their own. So the thing that you're selling generates revenue, and that's a cost center. And so you're going to have to put the indirect costs like kind of levying a tax on a cost center. And the activities that provide the support are generating the indirect costs that are put on top of the cost centers. So purchasing, quality control, IT department, supervising, and so on. They generate the indirect costs. And then the driver is a volume. So it's like how much activity is being demanded of these departments that provide support. And so in the case of the purchasing department, how would they measure how busy they are? Like when the purchasing department complains of a busy month, maybe it's because they've received a lot of purchasing orders. And so what you could do is you could add up which of the cost centers were sending you equipment orders. And so if you're trying to look for who's going to cut, if you're in the purchasing department and you've got employees to pay their salaries, and you've got costs of mail, and you've got expenses associated with your own office operations, you have to find someone who's going to cover those costs. And what the idea here in activity-based costing is that the indirect costs should be proportional to the demand for your activities. And so if it is quality control, the group that's inspecting the thing that's produced, well, you have to look at how their time is being used, and so it might be on the basis of number of items inspected, okay, and so on. So here in part 2, on the back side of the paper that I've given you, it's saying that there's a certain college with 3 different majors, and what we're trying to do is figure out if the IT department has a budget of $145,000, let's use the activities of each of these cost centers to figure out how much of the $145,000 has to be covered by engineering, safety, and computer science. And there's a couple of different ways you could look at it. And the question is going to be, if you were in the safety division, which of these 3 methods would you want the indirect costs to be allocated on the basis of? Or if you were in the computer science division, like which rationale makes the most sense to you? So these are different drivers. Okay, I'll put the solution up on the screen if you want to have a look here. So there's 3 different ways to say how much each division is going to have to pay. And it looks like if you were the engineering division, you'd be arguing that it should be on the basis of the number of computers, because that's what's going to make it so that you have the smallest share of the overall costs. But then if you were the safety division, then you'd say, well, we've got the smallest number of student enrollment, so we should have to pay, no, actually, I guess the basis of number of computers would be even more favorable for the safety division. The point is that there's just different ways to allocate the costs, and to know which one is right, you'd have to try and ask the IT department, how do you spend your time? Do you spend your time answering questions from professors? Do you have your time demanded on the basis of the students? Like what is driving the demand for your services? And then maybe it could be a weighted average of each of these different methods. So that's the idea of activity-based costing. I'll leave it up in case you're still trying to copy some of those figures. I'll see you next Monday since class on Friday is recorded.
Let me know Monday we have a 1 in 3 chance of having a quiz. You won't be the type of guy that will give you the quiz on the last day of class.
I am definitely that kind of guy, but I don't know. I'd say there's maybe a better than a 1 in 3 chance for Monday.
Like a 3 in 3 chance?
Well, look at it this way. I'm so mean that I'll either do it immediately after a recorded lecture or on the last day. So maybe there's a 50% chance on Monday and a 50% chance on Friday. And just since I told you that, then that means there's maybe a 50% chance on Wednesday because I'm trying to throw you off.
Right.
Yeah.